All right, so we know we're in a long-term drought now, and one of the offices and one of the great institutions in our state is North Carolina Climate Office, and we have Corey Davis from the North Carolina Climate Office. And Corey, thanks for joining us. You guys track all things climate here in the state, and one of the first things I do on Thursdays when the drought monitor comes out, I love reading your guys' synopsis of the drought for the state. Talk a little bit about this drought. We know drought is cyclical here in the Carolinas. What have you noticed that is unique about this drought this go around?
Well, Brad and Brittany, thanks for having me. I like to say that droughts are a little like snowflakes. Everyone is unique, and sometimes we go several years without any at all. And that's the case right now. We've been lucky. Over the last 5 to 10 years, we have been in a mostly wet climate here in the Carolinas. Of course, that means we've had some pretty heavy rain events. You think about Florence, you think about Helene, but it also means that the few droughts we've had have been more of that short-term, even flash drought variety. They've lasted for a few weeks, a couple months at the most, and then they faded. We've gotten some good rainfall, and that's really ended those drought impacts. So we really have to go back to 2016 in parts of western North Carolina, 2007 and 2008 across parts of the Piedmont to find a drought that has lasted this long and reached this level of severity. We're now at the D3 extreme drought level. That's only happened a handful of times in the Charlotte era, in the U.S. Drought Monitor era, which goes back to 2000. So it's definitely a rare event, and this is one of the few times where we've seen that extreme drought emerging during the spring. We talk about the origins of this drought. It really didn't start over the last month. It started 6 months ago in the fall. And over that time, we've seen those deficits increase, like your graphic now is showing, month after month of getting below normal rainfall. And it's like that drought was hibernating all winter, and now it's woken up like a really hungry bear. We've had some dry and hot weather over the last few weeks, and that has just poked that bear. That's why we're seeing those impacts seem like they're suddenly emerging. But again, this has been brewing in the background for several months now.
Yeah, Brittany and I talk about this all the time because during the winter, I felt like we talked about the drought a lot. But for the public, it's hard for them to recognize a drought during the winter months because everything's dormant and there's no vegetation and they're not using water as much. And when it does rain in the winter, it tends to just sit in the topsoil. So this comment we got all the time, we'd release the drought monitor and they'd be like, "What are you talking about? I got mud in my backyard." And they don't realize that's just water sitting on the very surface. You brought up a good point about this emerging in the spring, and that's kind of the worst time for this to really get severe because the spring is usually a wet time of year for us, Corey.
That's right. One of the big challenges is that over this winter, we know it was drier than normal. Part of that was because of the La Nina pattern that we were in. But even in a drier than normal winter, we can usually see at least a little bit of recharge. If those soil moisture levels or stream flow levels or groundwater levels or even lake levels are a little dry going into the winter, it only takes a few inches of rain a couple times during the season to really boost those back up to where they ought to be going in the spring. And we just never got that this year. Even after the one big snow event that we had in late January, early February, that snow sat on the ground for so long that most of it actually sublimated. It went straight from ice to water vapor, and it never really soaked into the ground. The ground was frozen, so it wasn't easy for water to penetrate there. And as a result, even after that one decent precipitation event, we were still pretty dry. So that's part of why we have been so dry coming into the spring. And again, you look at 90-degree weather, you look at barely half an inch of rain over the last month. That has only made it worse now that we're in April.
Yeah, it's sublimated, and then we also really didn't have that much in the grand scheme of things since the snow to liquid ratio was like 29 to 1. Corey, so the State Climate Office, you specifically, you guys have a lot of really good information and blogs that you've posted about the 2007 to 2008 drought, which if you're in the Charlotte area, that's the big one. I think most people remember almost 20 years ago. I know that also started partially because of a La Nina winter, but have you guys looked back at all to see if there's been any other similarities maybe in the start of this drought compared to that one that was almost now 20 years ago?
In some ways, it's good news and bad news because there are some differences here. One of those is just that timing of emergence. You said that there was a La Nina pattern in the winter of 2007. also one this past year. But really, that 2007 drought started to get so much worse over the summer. It was one of the hottest summers on record, including our hottest August on record in North Carolina, with very little rainfall, very little tropical activity later that fall. And that's really when that 2007 drought hit its peak. It was in the fall, going into the winter. We saw widespread exceptional drought, and that led to those water restrictions. In this case, we got those deficits building in the fall and in the winter. That's our cool season. That's why it's taken so long to see those impacts. So in a way, that's a good sign. That means that we were getting some of that dry weather out of the way at a time of the year where it matters a little bit less. Yeah. The problem is that if this drought stretches on through the summer or even into the fall, we are getting a head start on where we were in 2007. That means those deficits could get even higher than they were in that drought, and that means that, again, we're already seeing water restrictions. Those impacts could be even worse this time if this drought persists.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to leave you with one last question. I got to ask you a climate question because there's all this talk, Corey. It's like crazy. I've never heard El Nino get so much buzz than I have this spring, and we've got the possibility of a super El Nino, and I think everybody feels like it's a silver bullet that's going to help us. But talk to the people watching out there. We kind of know that El Nino, if it does develop, it's still several months away, and the impacts for us from rain is usually in the cool season. What are you guys thinking about this El Nino and maybe the flip in the pattern that we could get at some point over the next 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, you're spot on with that, Brad. I tell people that when we go into an El Nino pattern, typically the first impacts we see are around the peak of hurricane season and after, and that's actually not a good sign for us. We may have less tropical activity because those upper level winds in an El Nino tend to hold down Atlantic storm formation. So that means if we're still in a drought by the summer going into the fall, it actually could get even worse. We could miss out on some of that tropical rainfall. And then once we do get into this next winter, if that strong El Nino holds shape, it looks like that should bring more moisture, more storm systems our way, so that should at least bring some relief. There's one other comparison I'll give for you, Brad, and that's just looking back 1 year ago. We were also coming out of a La Nina. We were dry through the spring in March and April last year. Then we got into May and started getting better rainfall chances. So I know looking at some of the long-term outlooks, it's rightful to be skeptical that those are showing above normal precipitation, but there is a close analog in what we went through just last year. So fingers crossed over the next few weeks, we will start to see some of those better rain chances.
Yeah, just a couple stalled fronts in May, or maybe an MCS track setup would be nice just to get us out of that. Corey, thank you so much. You guys do great work up there. It's a must read, as Brittany said. You guys do great blogs, great content. If you're ever interested in looking back historical references to some of these droughts, which happen here, we seem to be a state of extremes. It's either going to be super wet or super dry, Corey. I don't feel like we're ever anywhere in between.
Yeah, you said it. And, the farmers feel the same thing. If it's not enough rain like it is now, then it's too much rain and their fields are flooded. So, yeah, it affects us all.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Corey, thank you so much from the State Climate Office. Great site to go to.